Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our Persian Love Cake live stream class. My name is Carrie. I am City Market's Assistant Outreach and Education Manager. I'm the one who's been sending you all of those emails, so now you can put a face to a name, or at least half a face at this point. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's great to be able to have these classes with everybody when we can all gather together. I'd love to know where people are watching from, so if you feel up to it, go ahead and put where you're watching from in the chat. You'll see a little Q&A box. You can submit that and I'll see that. Speaking of Q&A, if at any time during this class you do have a question, go ahead and type that into that Q&A box. I'll see that and I can feed the questions to our instructor or answer them with typing if it's something that I can answer on my end. So if you have any questions, like I said, I'll be kind of behind the scenes. You'll hear my voice every now and again asking a question that's been asked by one of our participants. I'll send a survey out tomorrow. I'd love to know what people thought about the class and other ideas for live stream classes that you'd like to see. Without further ado, I will turn things over to our instructor, Anna. And again, if you have questions at any time, go ahead and type those into the chat. If you're joining us a little bit late, you can always hit live down near the play pause button, and that will catch you up to where we are rather than having you start from the beginning. Thanks so much. Anna, take it away.
Good evening. My name is Anna Mays, and I'm really excited to be able to teach one of my favorite dessert recipes this evening, the Persian Love Cake. I imagine many of you have come across this cake either on restaurant menus or in people's homes. It's been a very popular dessert to offer guests, probably for about the last 12 to 15 years. A recipe that was given to me by an Iranian chef in Philadelphia. Years ago, I took a cooking class with her, probably around 2010, and it's really remained one of my go-to recipes. There are many versions of this cake, and I think that this particular recipe is a great one. It's a little bit different from some of the ones you've seen on Instagram probably, because it uses a semolina flour. And we're going to be talking about all the different ingredients. But before we begin, I wanted to just take a moment to give a little bit of history and context to this cake. I have been, for the last few months, trying to research its origins. I sort of had this idea that, Persian love cake sounded like this ancient traditional dessert with a wonderful story, and I have been very interested to find that the origin of this cake is not what I originally expected. So tonight I'm going to try to talk a little bit about that. This is also a really exciting time to be able to offer this class. Not just because today felt like it was really springtime here in Vermont. It was a beautiful day, but also because on March 20th began the Persian New Year celebration. Nowruz is a festival that has been celebrated since 3000 BC. It's currently celebrated by about 300 million people worldwide. It's considered nowadays more of a secular holiday that celebrates the arrival of spring. People clean their homes, buy new clothes. They sort of prepare for this beginning of spring, and it's celebrated in many different ways in many different countries. It's still a religious holiday to Zoroastrians and some Baha'i and Muslim communities, but for many it's a time to sort of purchase flowers, have parties, go and visit neighbors and the elderly, family and friends, and it's a time to sort of make peace around any conflicts, and it's a really great to be talking a little bit more about some of the Nowruz traditions at the end of the class. And if anybody actually, has favorite parts of that holiday that you celebrate, I'd love to hear in the chat. Feel free to type them in. But I'm aiming to, first of all, cover this cake recipe, teaching you about the different ingredients. We'll talk about some substitutes you can use to modify for dietary needs. And then also, I'll be trying to talk about some just very basic baking techniques. My training is in French culinary studies, and so I do a lot of things sort of the French way, but I'll be sharing different ways that we can kind of make sure our baking is as good as it can be. But first, I just wanted to start with the legend that is behind this cake. So many of you may have heard this. The Persian love cake is supposed to be has come out of this story where there was a young girl in Persia, in probably ancient Iran, who fell in love with a prince. And she was a poor girl. She wanted to impress this prince, and baked him a cake and filled it with all of these aromatic spices, as well as some sort of love potions that she concocted. Presented him the cake, and there are actually 3 different versions of how the story ends. One is that he took 1 bite of the cake and it was so delicious he fell madly in love with her. Another was he took a bite of the cake, really didn't like it, and said no to her. She went home and took the rest of the cake and ate it in sort of consultation for that no. And the 3rd version of the story says that this prince was severely allergic to saffron and died when he ate the cake. So that's those are a little bit of the legend behind this cake. Having heard those stories, I was really curious to understand, how far back this cake dated. And I tried to reach the original chef who gave me the recipe. I didn't have her contact details anymore. So I spoke to some Iranian friends here in Burlington, and very interestingly, they said that this was a cake they had never heard of. These are folks who left Iran in the 50s, so an older generation, and specifically they said that there was nothing that resembled a traditional cake when they were in Iran. So I did some further digging and looking around, and in none of the old cookbooks are there such a cake, or really any cake of this sort. The only similar cake in the region is the basbousa cake, which originates in Egypt and is very popular in Iraq and other countries throughout the Middle East. And that also is a semolina cake. So my guess is, my earlier guess was that this sort of had somehow emerged from that basbousa cake. But just this week, I actually got some answers to some queries I had made. And it turns out that, as far as I can tell, the earliest appearance of this cake was actually in 2008, when an Australian chef basically combined a recipe for an Armenian nutmeg cake with another recipe and sort of came up with this cake. He named it himself Persian Love Cake. And it was featured in an article in the Gourmet Traveler, and it basically went viral. Everybody loved this cake. He served it at his restaurant in Australia. And I think that really was the sort of birth of this Persian love cake, as modern as that is. There's a cookbook author. I wanted to show you this book. She's a British Iranian author, Yasmin Khan, and she includes the Persian love cake in her book. This is a wonderful book on Persian cuisine. And I actually got an email back from her this morning and she says very specifically, there is no such cake like this in Iran. Nobody makes it or serves it. This was a cake that she liked the name because it sounded nice and it reminded her of a Persian garden. So I wanted to be a responsible anthropologist. I'm a culinary anthropologist by training, and let you know that this cake is pretty surely a modern invention, but using very traditional ingredients. So much of the more traditional Persian Iranian desserts are things like rice puddings that use a lot of flavoring like rose water or saffron or cardamom. Cookies or finger sweets, perhaps more in the Indian style we're used to, that are made from rice flour or almond flour, that again use these spices and maybe rose petals, rose water. Things like jellos are really popular, made from things like sour cherries or sumac. So there are many traditional desserts that sort of are similar in flavor to what we're going to make tonight. But I did want to let you know this is a sort of a modern cake. So
we've got a question already.
Yeah.
If you don't mind taking a quick pause.
Yes.
Can cornmeal be substituted for the semolina?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, absolutely. So semolina, which is one of the 2 flours in this cake, is a very coarse grind of a durum wheat. It's called the middling. It's a purified middling, which is basically the middle process of the milling. And it's just much coarser, and actually cornmeal is very similar to it. And there are different amounts of coarseness you can get. If you go to a Middle Eastern market, you can get sort of more fine or thicker, coarser grind. And really feel free to experiment. I would, yeah, definitely try the cornmeal. For those who want to make this cake gluten-free, you can actually use 100% almond flour. So just increase the amount. Let me see in the ingredients where it says 1 cup of semolina, just use a cup of almond instead of that. Other substitutes, if you don't have semolina, you can use all-purpose flour. That's fine. It just won't have that sort of more coarse, mealy texture that is pretty sort of a characteristic of this cake. And then in terms of other substitutes, this would be a hard one to do dairy-free because it does have a lot of butter and yogurt, but you probably could swap an oil and then maybe a vegan yogurt if you wanted to do that, and maybe flax eggs.
Someone asked, if this isn't eaten in Iran, do you know where those 3 different origin stories come from? Like, how does it have that history if it's not?
That is a great question. So the places that I have read those stories are all blogs online without citations or references. So my guess is, and one of the bloggers even said that they conjectured that these stories were actually invented to fit the cake rather than vice versa. And based on the fact that the 2 Iranian sort of scholars that I spoke with about this had no knowledge of the cake in Iran, I would say that probably the stories were made up, but I love legends and I don't want to ever contradict them. So if anyone has further details, I'd love to know where the stories come from.
And I'll just interject real quick. We are recording this for people that are asking. The recording will go up on our website at a later date. So thank you all for joining us live, but you will be able to watch this back. Hopefully within a few weeks, we'll get it up on our website.
Yeah, great. Great, so I'm gonna start the baking process. I know some folks are cooking along, which is great. Feel free to ask any questions. If you're not cooking along, take notes and type in any questions you might have. I wanna make sure to answer everyone's questions. Again, I also am using this class as a bit of an intro to baking techniques. So I wanted to start by just talking about some of the basic practices that I was taught in culinary school that I think are just really helpful in terms of making sure our final product comes out as we want it. So number 1, when we're baking, it's great to be able to measure based on weight and to use a scale. If you don't already have a kitchen scale, it's a worthwhile investment. They run from 20 to however many dollars you want to spend, but you can get a fairly accurate one, a very accurate one for around $20 to $30. And that is because if you're measuring by volume, like if you imagine taking a measuring cup and scooping your flour, that's going to become very compact, and you can see it's not going to be a uniform amount of flour, versus if we're measuring by weight, and especially using the metric system and using grams, which are very kind of a very small measurement, then that means we're going to be able to really make sure we're getting exactly the same amount of that. Another reason I like using the metric system and measuring by weight is it's much easier to scale a recipe up or down. So if you were going to, make 2 or 3 times this recipe, for me, it's a lot easier to do 250 times 3 than 2.5 cups times 3 or 8 tablespoons. But that's just a little plug for a scale if you don't already have one. Another thing that's helpful is to do your mise en place before you start. So that refers to the practice of gathering your ingredients and measuring them all out and having them in front of you. I like to say, and this is one of my teachers in culinary school would say, you're going to be on your feet a lot, like running around baking for the next few hours. And it's nice to start by sitting down, getting maybe a cup of tea, and just like reading through your recipe in a leisurely manner rather than just like kind of hustling and starting right away. It's important to understand really the process you're going through and all of the different steps. And that's going to help you be able to make sure you've got everything and have everything prepped correctly, and that you're not missing like the last ingredient on the list. Once you've done your mise en place, and I've scaled out most of these things already, then we can begin. So this recipe starts with just preheating your oven and then preparing your pan. So as you can see, there's a lot of sugar and sort of heavy, sticky products in this recipe.
Yeah, someone actually commented the sugar proportion seems very high.
Yes, yes, it is. And you know, I'm not a big sugar fan, and so I was a little bit skeptical when I started this recipe in the class years ago. But miraculously, there is something about the combination of the spices and the almond flour with the yogurt and the sugar that makes this recipe not at all too sweet, in my opinion. And I think it's also perhaps traditionally or recently has been enjoyed with coffee and like a bitter flavor to balance out that sweet. But I'll be curious, yeah, what you all think when you actually bake it, if it's not too sweet. I think it's really the fact that it has a lot of brown sugar with the cardamom. They just go really well together. But yes, good observation. The sugar proportion is very high.
Someone wants to know if the cake can be frozen.
Yeah, so I would not recommend freezing this cake, mainly because it is a very dense but not very solid mass. And I think that with the freezing, taking it in and out of the freezer and then thawing, you're likely going to have cracks in the cake. Rather, what I would do is freeze the batter. So you can prep your batter and then just stick that in the freezer and then let that thaw and then bake it off. But if you don't care about how it looks, then you could freeze it.
One other quick question before you get started. Someone says, is saffron an ingredient you'll be using today? I don't see it on the list.
Yeah, so I have not included the saffron in this list in case anyone is giving it to a prince who is allergic to saffron. No. My experience, and I've tried this cake many different ways, saffron is one variation. There are lots of variations. But my experience is that because the cardamom is so strong and the sugar flavor is so kind of pronounced, I have not really been able to taste the saffron when I add it into this using the cardamom. And I definitely didn't want to decrease the cardamom in this recipe. So feel free to experiment and use saffron. I just felt like this isn't a dish where it can really shine unless you dial back some of the other really strong ingredients. But yeah, saffron is there's another version with saffron. There's one with nutmeg. There's one with orange, with like just orange flavoring it. So absolutely experiment with different things. So to begin with, I'm starting to explain that it's important to have the right pan for this cake because of its consistency and the stickiness at the end. So often I will just use, you can see my very well used, well-loved baking pan, just a baking tin with a little insert of parchment paper, and that works fine. However, for this cake, it is very heavy and very sticky, so it is really important to use a springform pan. If you haven't seen one of these before, the great thing about them is that you basically shrink the exterior, and then you can open it up and it will loosen around the cake. So even if your cake is very fragile or sticky, you'll be able to get it out, hopefully. So what I like to do with this, and it's not absolutely necessary to use a lining paper, but I like to just because it helps slide it out at the end. And we're kind of doing, this is the first step in the recipe, but it's sort of the last step. You'll appreciate this at the end once this has been done well. So you're going to start with laying some parchment paper over the bottom insert and then just tightening it up.
Is cardamom a little bit like nutmeg, or is there another good substitute?
Oh, you can substitute nutmeg. I would say that cardamom is really the main taste and flavor in this cake. And so if you could get a whole of cardamom, I would definitely recommend trying to. It's just an amazing flavor. If you really can't or you don't like it, you can use other spices like nutmeg or cinnamon, mace. I would make probably a blend of those three spices. You could add in some ginger. or you can you could add some rose water to the actual batter of the cake, or just do a lot of orange zest and maybe some orange blossom water. So those are some other flavor directions you could go.
Along with that, can they use pre-ground cardamom versus fresh?
Yes, I'm gonna get to that. I have a whole little explanation.
You've got a lot of questions coming in already. People are really into this.
This is awesome. So I'm just gonna finish with the cake pan and then I'll get to the spices. So you could do it like this, or to be extra safe, again, because this cake is gonna get really sticky, I like to just brush it with a little bit of butter. And this is butter that I've melted to use in the cake. I only melted it because it was a little bit hard from the fridge. You don't have to melt it, but I like to just brush it a little bit with butter, and that will make it come out a little bit easier. You can, in the old days, we buttered and floured, and for some cakes, I think that's good. That's not really necessary for this, but you can give it a try. If your cake pan happens to stick doing it this way, the next time you can try it with dusting it with a little flour.
Someone's hoping to make half the recipe and use a 6-inch springform with the cooking time change.
Oh yeah, that's great. Yes, and I'll talk about the cooking time at the end, because this is a cake that really varies based on oven, based on how big your pan is. So I'm going to give you some tricks for what to watch for rather than the actual time. But basically, you're looking for it to be firm enough to not really indent with your finger, and to be a pretty dark, like a golden brown. It's better to be overbaked than underbaked for this one.
More questions coming in if you're okay, or if you want me to hold them, just let me know.
I'll just finish with this and then we'll go back to the questions. So one thing to keep in mind with a springform pan, because it is a little bit open, and this actually applies to any pan, I think it's a good practice to do, is to just always bake your cake on a sheet tray. And that is because sometimes it might overflow and spill over. It's also because sometimes the bottom of the cake can burn, and this actually gives it a little bit more of a barrier between if you're down close to the bottom of the oven. So this is prepped. I'm going to set it aside for once we've got our batter ready. Okay, so I think first I'll get back to the question about the cardamom, if that's okay. So as I mentioned before, cardamom is a wonderful spice that is used throughout many dishes, both savory and sweet, in Iran and the surrounding countries. And it has a long history of use both in culinary dishes as well as medicinal use. There are many uses of it in Ayurveda. It's originally from the Indian subcontinent, and there are two types of cardamom. There's the green or true cardamom, and then there's black cardamom. The black cardamom has a much more kind of bitter tannic flavor. And for this recipe, we definitely want the green. There's also a white cardamom, but yeah, what we're looking for is the green or the true cardamom. And when you take the pods, if you are at a store where you can, actually find these, because sometimes it's hard to find the cardamom pods, it's really amazing to smell the smell of fresh
Zoom in a little bit so people can see the pods.
Yeah, let me show you the pods. And what's neat is that there's such variation. You can see here, some are dark green, some are light green. I find these pods fascinating. And once you crack them open, you'll have these like little kind of pockets of seeds all clinging together around the sort of stem of the pod. And it's really worthwhile to search out whole cardamom pods, or if you can't find whole cardamom pods, the whole seeds. So I did some grinding and crushing of cardamom earlier today, and you can see these are the seeds, as well as a little bit of chaff that's come out of the pods. And the best way to process them is just with a mortar and pestle. And so if you can, my preference would be to get the pods. Second preference would be then the seeds. And if you can't find any of those, the pre-ground cardamom is okay. The thing is, with spice production the way that it is, and supply, especially this year during the pandemic, spices generally tend to sit on warehouse shelves before they reach the grocery store for many months, many years sometimes. And I know there have been so many supply issues this year. I would be a bit dubious of purchasing pre-ground spices at this point in time, because they probably have had a really long shelf life already. So what you want to do is just, look for something. If a supplier, if you're ordering online, there's some great spice sourcing companies online that you can actually know exactly what farm they're from, when they've been received on this end, what harvest they're from. So I would recommend doing a little bit of research before investing in cardamom. I was really surprised to see when I purchased this. We don't have it right now at City Market. I had to go to Healthy Living to find this, but it was about $85 a pound. So this little bit was like $10 or something. So if you're going to invest in this spice, definitely you want to make sure that it's fresh. Yeah.
Someone said,
more of a
one second.
kind of fragrant smell. Yeah. Just one moment here.
I'm gonna plug this back in.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a real difference between the black cardamom and the green cardamom. I was really shocked the first time I had black cardamom. It's very strong and pronounced. I think it takes an experienced chef to be able to really work well with black cardamom. But in a lot of savory dishes, it can be really delicious. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions before we get into baking?
Yes, there's a lot. Everybody's really into this.
Oh, okay.
If I find it too sweet, can we reduce the sugar by 100 grams? Or will messing with the recipe mess with the texture?
Yeah. So if I would love it if you try it as it is first. But if you've tried that cake and find it too sweet, then yes. Let me see. By 100 grams. Yeah, I would do that, but still do, half white sugar and half brown sugar. Yeah, you could absolutely try that. It shouldn't change the recipe too much. This is a very forgiving recipe, and there are so many versions of this recipe that have different proportions, different than a more kind of European, like French or Italian genoise cake that's got a lot of rise to it. You'll see this is going to be a very sort of dense and moist cake. So we don't have to worry quite so much about the rise. I think I might get started just for
this one's just one that I can read out too. Sorry, the Pakistani in our household just passed out thinking that nutmeg could be subbed for cardamom. Tell them they have to buy cardamom and they will be forever happy.
Yes, thank you for saying that. I feel the same way. Nutmeg and cardamom don't taste at all alike. But there are, in neighboring Armenia, there are lots of cakes that do have nutmeg as the main ingredient. But I would say for this cake, it would be awesome if you could source cardamom. That would be really great. Yeah, and I think I do remember reading an author commenting that nutmeg really isn't traditional in Persian cuisine, if anybody knows otherwise. But my sense is that I don't think I've really come across it in any traditional recipes. So.
Great, yeah, let's go ahead and get started. It's 6 o'clock, so if other people have questions, I will actually just save them for a good stopping point or when they're relevant.
Yeah, and we'll hope to have time at the end also for Q&A and maybe talk about some of the more kind of broader traditions around the new year. Okay, so I've scaled out my ingredients already, so just to move a little quicker. But once we have greased and prepped our tin, our baking pan, then we're going to mix our dry ingredients together. So almond flour, I would say, after the cardamom, is the other sort of star player in this recipe. Sometimes it's called almond meal, and you can actually make your own almond flour very easily if you have a Vitamix or a really strong blender. Just throw in some almonds if you don't mind having the skin on, and then just grind them down to a flour. If you go too far, it will turn into almond butter. But I think that it's actually really great to get that fresh flavor of almonds and grind the flour yourself. So we're going to put the almond flour and then the semolina that we talked about earlier. If anybody grew up eating cream of wheat, that's a sort of a pudding type dish that we have in the US that is made with a semolina. There are lots of puddings and both sweet and savory that are made in other parts of the world using semolina. But it's a great, I really like it. I think it really makes the texture of this cake.
It's used for pasta a lot too, right?
Used for pasta, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
We had someone comment, Burlap and Barrel has fair trade green cardamom, and Burlap and Barrel is a great supplier. They're fair trade, they're single origin. I love using them. So yeah, if you're looking to
great.
invest,
Yeah,
Burlap and Barrel.
Maybe you can put that in the chat. The name, yeah, that would be great. Thank you. So we're going to combine our 2 flours plus the baking powder. The cardamom and the salt. So what I did to get this cardamom, like it is here, is I processed the pods in my mortar and pestle at home. And then when they were in the seed state, I put them through my spice grinder, which you can see here. This is actually sold as a coffee grinder, and it works beautifully for spices. That way it's going to be the cleanest. And then once you have enough, it is a little bit more laborious. It definitely takes time to do, but it's really worth it. Add the cardamom. And it's great to use a whisk at this stage to blend your dry ingredients together. Okay. I'm going to set that aside, and now moving on to the wet ingredients. We're going to beat the butter and the 2 sugars together. And the recipe says to make sure your butter is soft, but no worries if it's not. A quick workaround is just to heat it up on the stove. This recipe, it does not matter if it's liquid butter because it's just going to be all blended together.
So that's like why someone who's vegan could substitute an oil if they wanted coconut oil?
Yes, okay. Exactly. Yeah, and actually I've seen versions of this cake with olive oil, and that's a wonderful substitute if you wanted to do that. Yeah.
I wonder if like one of the more heavy flavored oils like pistachio oil or almond oil would be good in it too.
You could totally try that almond oil, yeah, or pistachio. I mean, this is already an extremely decadent cake, so why not go all the way with those? So in terms of the sugar, it says brown sugar. I didn't specify if it should be light brown or dark brown, and that's because you can use either one. I tend to like dark brown because it just adds a little bit more of that sort of dark caramel flavor. But I've also used light brown sugar. If I use light brown sugar, I might, if I have it in the house, use raw sugar, like demerara sugar, or you can just use white sugar, it's fine. But I just like the sort of dark caramel flavor of this cake. And I think the darker sugars kind of help create that flavor. So I am going to apologize ahead of time because this is going to be very loud, and Carrie, who's very thoughtful, is going to turn off
mute us.
The sound for just a moment while I beat this. Okay.
Someone asked, how do you get the seed out of the cardamom pods? They couldn't quite hear you.
Oh yeah, sorry, thanks for asking. So what you want to do is put a handful of the pods into a mortar and pestle, and you could also use a knife, the flat side of a knife against a cutting board, and kind of apply pressure if you don't have a mortar and pestle. But this is actually a really great and easy way, and you just sort of bang on them. And it doesn't matter if you're crushing the seeds a little bit because you're going to be grinding them anyways. And then you can see the seeds have sort of come out of the pods and are just like mostly hanging out in the bottom. If you've ever sort of threshed wheat, it's sort of the same concept. You want to just like bang on it, and then the chaff, the pods are really light, and then you're just going to kind of scoop them out, and then you'll have like all of these seeds at the bottom. So that's how you do it. It's pretty straightforward. You can also do it by hand, again with the knife. sort of the idea, like with pressing garlic, you just press down and then you'd open it kind of manually with your fingers. If you have any, you know, helpers in the house, like young helpers who want to keep their hands busy, this could be a great job, a task for them.
And it makes your hands smell good.
Oh my gosh, it makes your hands smell so good. Yeah. It's sort of the opposite experience of garlic.
Yeah.
With garlic. Yeah. So then we're going to add the eggs, and I have a little egg spiel I like to give that if you're storing eggs for the long term in your fridge, like I get eggs delivered to my neighborhood each week, and I try to get a couple dozen, and then sometimes I store them for a number of weeks. You want to actually always store your eggs with the small end down, because that will preserve their shelf life. There's a little pocket of air underneath the yolk in the egg. And if you store it like this, that air is going to go up into the yolk and it will basically oxify your yolk and it will spoil a little faster. So if you get your eggs locally, most farmers, they know to store eggs like this. They're already like that. But if you are storing eggs for the long term, that's just a quick technique to do. Then generally, you don't want to, I was always taught never to bang your egg on the side of your bowl, because there's more of a chance that you're going to have some of the shell go in and poke your yolk. So we were always taught to bang your egg on the table. And then the last step in good egg technique is to give it a sniff before you add it to your batter. It does not happen often, but there can be bad eggs, and you definitely don't want to dirty your batter with a bad egg. That is a very sorry experience when that happens.
Do the green and black names for the cardamom refer to the seed color, the pod color, or something else? Everybody's really into cardamom. This is great.
Yeah, so that refers to the pod color. They are separate genuses, I think. They're completely different plants, and they're grown at different altitudes in different regions. So they're very, very different. It's not like it's you know, like a grape that we have the red or the green. These are sort of completely different plants. All right, so you would then blend in the eggs, but I'm just gonna jump ahead and then add the yogurt. Just a word about yogurt. It's great to use a full-fat Greek yogurt for this. Again, we're trying to make this a very kind of solid, moist batter, and I think that a non-Greek, sort of a thinner yogurt might make it a little bit too watery, and it would increase the cooking time. You'd have to cook it a lot longer to dry out. You could even strain your yogurt if it's a little bit on the watery side. Okay, I'm gonna blend this again for a few more minutes. And then the final step is to add the orange zest. And to zest an orange, it's really helpful to use a microplane here. You can use just a regular cheese grater, but I found that these work really well to get a very fine kind of grated piece of zest. And this is a step I would say it could be tempting to skip, but definitely if you can, add the orange, because it really adds to the flavor of the cake. Again, orange and citrus in general are used a lot in Iranian cuisine, and it's just lovely. Some people do add then the orange blossom flower at this stage. Okay, then the last step is to add our dry ingredients. And I know that the recipe says to stir with a wooden spoon. That's what I was taught. Often in a lot of traditional recipes, the wooden spoon is very important. That's featured prominently. And I really like that idea of, yeah, wood being used to blend things. So we'll do that. You can, if you have a good hand blender, I would say, you know, start by blending it with your beater still, which I'm going to do a little bit. Okay, so at this stage, I wish I could share with you the smell through the camera because it just has such a lovely smell. With the cardamom is blending with the orange. You can get a little bit of that almond flour. I imagine many of you have worked with almond flour before. It's just a wonderful. I'm very into almond flour right now. It's a great way to sort of add flavor at the same time you're adding your starch and protein. And it has a very high oil content. So that's another reason why this cake is so sort of heavy and rich, is because of the oil in the almond, whereas wheat flour doesn't really have that much. So once this is all blended together, we are going to pour it into our prepared baking pan.
Someone wanted to know if you've ever used lobster instead of yogurt.
Yes, that would be a great substitute, actually. It's a little bit thicker. I believe it is a Lebanese cheese, technically, and it's made from straining yogurt. So yeah, you could use labneh, and probably your cooking time would be a little bit less, my guess is, with that. But yeah, that would be great. I should mention, while we're talking about other things to add, I've actually experimented with a lot of different flours in this cake, and over the holidays I made it with buckwheat flour. And then actually just today I was reading that the chef Otto Lengi actually has a version of this with buckwheat flour in his book Sweet. If you are into his cooking, he's got a dessert book, and he makes this cake with, I think it's, I don't know the percentages almond to buckwheat, but it looked really good. So one thing when you're using almond flour is that it takes a little while to hydrate in a batter. And I don't think this was mentioned in the recipe, but I generally tend to let an almond flour-based batter sit for a little bit of time before baking. And that's just to let the liquid in the batter sort of hydrate the almond, and it makes it a little bit less kind of mealy in like a bad way. So if you have maybe an extra 20 to 30 minutes, you could just let this sit before going into the oven. Otherwise, our oven is preheated to 350 Fahrenheit, and we can just, you could put it in the oven as is, or there are many ways to decorate this cake, and that's something we're going to spend some time talking about. I was telling Carrie earlier that I think this cake is a really fun dessert for anybody who is artistic or crafty, because there are just so many fun ways you can garnish and decorate it. So feel free to, yeah, experiment and plate it in a beautiful way. I'm going to show you the sort of traditional way, the way I was taught to finish this cake. But another option is, before baking, you can sprinkle on some pistachios. I'm going to garnish it with pistachios. Sorry, I should mention, I have actually pre-baked another cake that I'm going to be demoing the decorating part, just because of time. We wouldn't have time to do the 40 to 60 minute bake. So I'm actually going to show you two ways of decorating. So one might be to just sprinkle some almonds on before baking, or sorry, some pistachios before baking. You could use almonds, like slivered almonds too. I've seen people do that. And then I'm going to sort of give these a little pat so that they are a little submerged into the batter. And I'm just going to do the exterior so that I leave room for some other garnishes, probably the rose petals in the interior of the cake. But you could be very decadent and just put pistachios over the whole top.
I'm hearing that some people are having some sound issues, but I have the stream going on my phone and it sounds fine to me. If people are having issues, please let me know. I think we're unmuted and we should be fine, but it sounds like maybe a couple people are having issues. So
okay, I can try to speak up also.
No, I think it's maybe some people are having some tech issues on their end.
Okay.
Because I definitely unmuted after we finished that last round of feeding and I can hear us.
Yeah, so. Okay, all right. So while we put that in the oven, you want to do a quick wash of your hand beaters. I'm going to pass these over. Well, now put this on its baking tray into the oven for 40 to 60 minutes. So this is a relatively kind of subjective part because ovens really vary, and I've seen this cake be done in 40 minutes, but then I've also seen it take over an hour. The risk with this cake is that the center will not get fully baked, whereas the top will get really brown. So what I would suggest doing is after about 40 minutes, if you still feel that it's soft, you could cover it with tin foil if it looks like it's going to need another maybe half an hour or so. You might need to bake it more than the 60 minutes, depending also again on your, the yogurt that you've used, the ingredients. If it's a more moist batter, it might need a little bit more time. The risk of under baking is not so much for the taste. It's going to taste really good. It sort of has that texture of like gooey brownies or fudge. It's really good. It's just that it will be a lot harder to get out of the pan without cracking or sort of falling apart. So I'm going to put it in the oven for 40 to 60 minutes.
Do you want to take a couple questions?
Yeah, now's a great time. Well, let's pretend that that's baking, well, it is baking, and then I'll bring out the finished cake and we can talk about the decorating. But yeah, now's a great time for some questions.
Great, yeah. Just wanted confirmation on what size springform pan you're using for this one.
Yeah, so this I think is a 9.5. I think in the recipe it called for a 9 or a 10-inch springform pan.
And do you have any recommendations of brands of springform that you like? Stainless steel specifically.
That's a great question. I actually love to scrounge these at thrift shops or like the Goodwill or the Salvation Army. I find that oftentimes I feel like older cooks are getting rid of these baking pans. And as long as it is well greased or buttered, you don't need like a non-stick one. It should be fine. So that's the beauty of the springform pan, is because it expands, you open it up, you don't need to have that non-stick finish.
Great. Could orange extract be used instead of zest?
Yeah, great question. So I definitely use that in a pinch. If I don't have orange zest, I will put in a little bit of orange extract. Yeah, that's a great sub.
Or orange blossom water, because I'm sure you probably have that in your
Yeah, so I find that orange blossom water takes more of the liquid to create the same amount of flavor. And that's, you can imagine the extract is really a concentrated form. So they definitely, I would say they're not substitutes one-to-one, but you would need to add a little bit more of the orange flavor. And then you might be adding like a good amount of liquid to the cake. So you could definitely use it. And like I said before, rose water and orange blossom water are both definitely used in this cake. But to get as much of an orange flavor as the grated orange, the zested orange, you probably would need the extract.
Great. What is the shelf life of eggs in the fridge?
Oh, so it all depends when they were laid. And it's hard to tell often with the way that labeling is on cartons. I think there used to be like codes that would tell you when it was and rather than a date. But I generally, my brother has a farm and raises chickens, and I think they are able to, keep those eggs for months in the fridge. But that's because they're going directly the day it was laid into a fridge, and then isn't spending a lot of time in transit. But I would say, yeah, probably 3 to 4 weeks if it's a good quality egg. Yeah.
Great. When you substituted buckwheat flour for the semolina, did you use just buckwheat or some white flour, and were you happy with the results?
Yeah, so great question. I used I think what I did was I used maybe half a cup of buckwheat flour and then used almond flour for the rest. So did half a cup of almond, half a cup of buckwheat instead of the 1 cup of the semolina. And I really liked the results. I love the flavor of buckwheat. I think if you add much more, it's going to get kind of stiff, and that's enough to give it that buckwheat flavor.
Great, awesome. Last one for now, and then we'll move on to the decorating. Do the sides pull away from the pan as well for an indicator that this cake is finished? Like you mentioned, touching the middle.
Right. So what's interesting is because there aren't a lot of eggs and there's a lot of heavy stuff with the yogurt and the butter, the sides, they don't really pull away that much. They do sort of like dome up a little bit and harden, but that is not an indicator that the center of the cake is done. So I would use the old toothpick trick to just stick a toothpick in at the 40 or the 60 minutes and then pull it out and see, does it look like it's done or not? It should come out completely dry when it's done. Yeah. Great. I would say you could probably leave this cake in the oven for a full 2 hours and it would still be good and edible. Like it's that moist. It's really interesting how it behaves.
It reminds me almost of like a Basque cheesecake, how that's almost like a burnt cheesecake top, where this is gonna not, like the top might get burnt and super caramelized and tasty, but it's still gonna be a delicious cake.
Totally. And that's actually a great point. Don't be concerned. Don't use your normal way of judging like a Genoise cake, for this cake, because it's gonna get a lot darker. So don't be scared of that dark top. Speaking of, let me show you. So this is how my cake came out that I baked this afternoon. So let's imagine this is about an hour later, and I checked it after 40 minutes and it was a little bit soft at the top here. So I covered it with tin foil, and you can see how the sides, they haven't really kind of bounced in like they do with a more eggy cake. But the center, once you cut through, and we'll cut through it at the end and so you can see, is really, really moist. Again, it has that sort of like gooey brownie texture and feel, which is just so exciting when you have it with that sort of caramelized butter and sugar and cardamom. All right, so imagine that this came out of the oven in its pan. Okay, because this next step, I only had 1 springform pan of that size, so I couldn't actually demo that exactly. But imagine I'm pulling the one I just put in the oven out. It's piping hot, it's in its pan, and that's when we're going to put the lemon rosewater syrup on while it's hot. So let's make that syrup now. I don't know if you can see.
Yep, it's all on view. You're good.
Okay, great. If you have a tip for me just to go over it, up there. Thank you. So this is a very simple recipe that we're going to look at now, the rosewater syrup, and it's a very common recipe to Middle Eastern desserts in general. I've seen many desserts like baklava, other cakes that have this sort of syrup that serves as a way to seal the cake. So it basically is going to add a sweetness to the top, but also seal it from drying out. And as you can see, the top is a little bit drier than the rest of the cake, so I think that's why it works so well. So we're going to juice a lemon. You're looking for about 1/3 of a cup of lemon juice. This is, again, something where it would be great to use fresh lemon. I have a good quality lemon juice that I keep in my fridge at home for some things, but for this, again, I think the freshest, most kind of best quality ingredients are going to be the best. And then we're going to add about 1/3 of a cup of white sugar. And these proportions are not as strict as the batter proportions. Oftentimes I will just measure this, or I will just do it kind of without measuring it too strictly.
And that was a small typo in the recipe. I think you wanted to mention.
Oh yes, thank you. Yes, yes. So if you're following along with the instructions, I made a mistake. Number 6, it says while the cake is baking, make the syrup, put the lemon juice. It should say lemon juice, sugar, and rose water in a saucepan. So there's no water in this, although you could just make a simple syrup with water instead of the lemon juice. It would be fine. But the lemon adds just that really nice tartness that will, yeah, that somehow sort of balances all of the sweet of the cake. And then just a splash of rose water. This is, again, just a wonderful flavor. You can find this at City Market. If you're here in the Burlington area, Nadia's and Winooski, it's an Iraqi market. They carry this, and it's, yeah, they also have the orange blossom water. And it just, yeah, it smells wonderful. A little goes a long way with rose water. So I know some people find it a bit strong. Okay, so we're just going to bring this up to a simmer and simmer it for just 1 or 2 minutes to let the sugar dissolve.
I wanted to know if you can decorate the cake and then leave it in the fridge.
Yes, yes. It kind of depends what you're decorating it with, but yeah, this would definitely be good chilled. Yeah, probably for a day or 2.
And someone asks for your egg storing technique. When you say the short part of the egg, is that the flatter part or the tip? So you
oh,
said, like,
sorry, that's the tip.
Tip down.
Be, yeah, tip side down and sort of fatter part up. Yeah.
And someone just said, from someone who also does online cooking classes, wow, you get a lot of questions and you're doing an amazing job of answering them. So nicely done.
Thank you. Thanks so much. This is so great. I wish we could all be in the same classroom. I love teaching in person. And so I'm trying to make it as interactive as possible online. So thanks for the good questions.
One of these days we'll be able to do that again.
Yeah, yeah. So right now you can see this is very liquidy. And you want it to be reduced just a little bit more. I could put it on like this and that would be fine, but I'm gonna just reduce it and make it a little bit thicker. And so generally you would do this step while the cake is baking. You'll have, you know, about an hour to prep your syrup as well as the cream. Okay, so this is now thickened a little bit more. And this part is super fun because the cake comes out of the oven. Again, imagine it's still in its spring form pan. So it's got the sides that are gonna catch some of the syrup. And you can kind of tell that your cake is a little bit thirsty on the top. It's dry, it's like a little bit cracked. And it's like you're giving your cake exactly what it needs, a little bit of sweet syrup. And I like to use a pastry brush and just pour it on top. And again, you'll have the sides of your pan. We'll keep it from spilling. And then just brush it around to make sure everything is evenly coated. And the cake is just gonna like suck that syrup right into it. And within a few minutes, you won't really even notice that it's wet. It's really interesting.
Is there a good substitute for the rose water?
Oh, so the rose water is really about adding a flavor to it. So I would say to add whatever flavor you particularly like. You know, you could use maybe vanilla. You could put in an alcohol if you use alcohol. You could use probably the orange blossom water if you prefer, or you could just do it with the lemon. The lemon itself is pretty strong. If you wanted to go that direction, I might maybe add a little bit of lemon zest to the syrup. And that could be nice.
Yeah, we had someone that did that. I think they said they used the lemon zest.
Oh, nice. Yeah, if you want to really just highlight that lemon flavor, that would be delicious too, if you're not such a rose water fan. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say try rose water first before you put it into your cake, because some people, to me, like I love rose water, but some people say it makes things taste soapy because it's like a very back product smell.
Totally.
So I love rose water, but it's not for everybody.
It's not, yes, it does have sort of a reminiscence of certain perfumes, and I think originally it was a byproduct of the perfume industry. It's rose petals that are steeped in water, but they were, I think, the petals that were not going to be used in the perfuming. But it's, yeah, if you're interested in the rose and orange blossom waters, there's a lot of information online about kind of their history and how they're made. So at this point, you need to set the cake aside to cool before we do the final steps. But as this is sort of a demo cake, it is already pretty cool. So we're kind of ready to go. So I like to think of the cake now as sort of a blank palette, or like a canvas to really do whatever you want to do with. And I'm going to show you a couple of different options, but feel free to then just experiment at home. So if you signed up for this class on Eventbrite, you probably saw that, thank you, yes, that the image that was used to advertise this class had a very thick white icing on it. And that is, I feel like, a more perhaps like Western Americanized way of decorating a cake with that sort of powdered sugar icing. And what I've seen more with Middle Eastern and Persian desserts is to have things more sparsely decorated with nuts and seeds, berries, and rose petals, of course. So what I was going to do for this was to just show you a couple things. The first is to just use some powdered sugar. And do we have the? Yes, great. You're going to use a colander. So I'll just tell you kind of the first two, maybe the primary two ways that I like to decorate the cake. Thank you so much. One is simply to use pistachios that have been sort of roughly chopped and rose petals. And that I usually just decorate it by putting a little bit of pistachio on the outside and then some rose petals on the inside. Another thing you can do to add maybe a third kind of band of color is to cut out you can just use regular paper for this. And I just traced a cake tin here. And to cut that out and maybe set it in the center of your cake. And it's good to take a moment to get it centered. And then we can just kind of dust the cake with powdered sugar. I'm just doing it in the center to catch that so I can control it a little better as it goes on the cake. And then just kind of go around.
While you're doing that, someone wanted to check on the syrup. So no water in the syrup, just the lemon juice and the rose water as the liquids. And how do you know when the syrup is sufficiently reduced? I tend to reduce mine too much.
Yeah, so I would just give it maybe about 2 minutes. You want it to look basically like, I used to make violet syrup when I was little, and I was gonna say it's like that consistency. It's sort of like it's like maple syrup, but dial it a little bit back to be a little bit more liquidy. It's like right before maple syrup is ready. So it's sort of like, yeah, it's a little bit more liquidy than the maple syrup, I would say. You can't, it won't be bad if it's over reduced. It just means that it won't sort of seep into the cake quite so much. And if it's not quite reduced enough, it's not the end of the world either. It will just be a little bit kind of the moisture will go deeper into the top of the cake. So I would say feel free, once you've tried it a few times, feel free to adjust that consistency to how dry your cake is. If it looks really dry, if you've left it in a while, then maybe a little bit more liquidy is better.
And they also said they agree with the previous comment and you're doing wonderfully.
Oh, thank you guys. I wish I could see everyone and we could be here together. So then we can just sort of take off our paper in the middle, and there we have the beginning of our garnish with the sugar. And I always usually say to do this on a spare plate that's not your serving plate, because as you can see, you're going to get sugar around here. The only challenge with this cake is that it is not the easiest to transport from one plate to the other. That's because the bottom gets really sticky and it wants to stay on this plate. So if you are going to be moving it, just make sure that perhaps you put a little piece of paper under it to slide it out. But again, if you care about the presentation, you probably would want to then sort of transfer it to a plate that's not going to have your syrup on the side.
But we're going to be eating this.
But Carrie and I are going to be eating this, so it doesn't matter. Yeah. So then I've taken some pistachios that have already been roasted. I roasted them a little bit, and that is to just give them a kind of intensify the flavor and give them a rough chop. And what I like to try to do is start with the thicker pieces on the outside here, and then just kind of scatter them around. And this part does take a little bit of time, so I'm going to do it sort of hastily here, but at home you can really take your time. You could also do it, you know, on the white layer, on the white ring directly. I've seen beautiful Persian desserts that are decorated with very finely ground pistachios, and you use it almost like a sort of sand to draw out lines and make patterns. And you could do that too.
Tilt the camera a little bit down so people can see this just a little better.
Yeah.
So hold your horses. There we go. Nobody get dizzy from me tilting the camera.
Okay.
There we go. We can zoom a little bit.
So then we have our pistachio ring, and I just love that about pistachios. They're so vibrantly green. Like on the outside, you don't think that they're going to be that green, but then you chop them and they're just, yeah, they add just such a nice color of green. And then we can add our rose petals. So these I got at City Market here in Burlington. You can order them online. There are usually you can find them in Middle Eastern markets. They also are sold at like herbal stores. So here in Burlington, Real Yard Apothecary uses them, and so you can find them there. Again, you want to get them as fresh as possible. They do lose their color with time. So these look pretty vibrant. I think these are pretty fresh. And if you want them whole, you can put them like this. Or what I will sometimes do is put them through a spice grinder. Right now my spice grinder is filled with cardamom. A quick trick to fix that is just to you know, put a paper towel through, but then you can put maybe a cup of rice in there and grind it up and dump out the rice flour, and then that will be sort of perfectly clean. So I often use rice to clean my spice grinder, but if you want to have sort of a rose powder to put on the cake, then you could do that. And that's, I think, is especially nice when you have a white backdrop, like a white icing, and then to just add the powder. That can be pretty. So then I'm going to add this for today. I'm going to use the whole rose petals.
Could you make your own dried rose petals?
Oh yes, if you have a garden and roses, that would be super fun. You could just, I would say, to either dry them in the sun, or if you have a dehydrator, you could dry them pretty easily. Yeah.
So make sure they don't have anything sprayed on them and that they're a culinary variety, because I know certain, yeah, like food grade versus florist roses are not the same thing.
Totally, totally. Yeah. If you have just received a bouquet of red roses and want to dry it, I think I would be, that would be fun to use as a decoration that's not going to be part of the edible part of the cake. So maybe, put that on the side and just tell your guests not to eat those. But yeah, definitely decorating with roses is super fun.
It's 6:40, just letting you know.
Great. Thank you.
Plenty of time.
Yeah. Okay, so this is sort of a rough and ready job, but you can see here we've got the 3 rings. It's garnished. You can see a little bit of a kind of a sheen in the center where you still have the little bit of the syrup that's drying. If you wanted, you could put a dollop of the cream in the center here. I might do that and sprinkle it then with rose petals at the end. So just if you want to get a look at the cake. All right. So our final step now is You know, the cake would be great to eat now as it is, but to just kind of go that extra mile with for your guests, it has a really nice accompaniment that goes with it. And I'm really grateful to the woman who taught me this recipe, because I have not seen this in a lot of the other online versions of this cake. But she said that her family usually serves it with a spoonful of cultured cream, what she called cultured cream. And that is basically going to be whipped cream with a little bit of yogurt added in and sweetened with white sugar and then a splash of rose water. The rose water is optional, of course. You could also just put vanilla, but I think the rose water combines with the sort of tanginess of the yogurt to really make it a unique cream. I actually made this for an event last weekend, and someone was trying to guess what it was. She thought it was creme fraiche. And so I said it's really the yogurt that gives it that little bit of an extra kind of tangy flavor. So if you've been making whipped cream for a while, you probably know that the quality of cream you use is really important to the final product. This is different from anything you're going to bake using cream. It's very important, I find, to have that sweetest, sort of richest whipped cream flavor, to get a cream that has not been high temp pasteurized. That's sort of hard to find in most grocery stores, but if you have a local co-op or access to, you know, farm cream, they generally use a lower temperature to pasteurize the cream. When it's high temp pasteurized, it almost has like a cooked milk flavor to it that just takes away the sweetness. So this is a cream I absolutely love. I feel like it's sort of worth its weight in gold because it is quite heavy or quite expensive. This is 1 pint and it was like $7.
Great stuff.
But it's from Better Works Farm in the Northeast Kingdom here in Vermont, and it's the most amazing cream. Doc Leeser, who started that farm years ago, has invested so much in his soil for the pasture for his cows. He called it nutrient dense pasture for his cows, and you can just taste that in the cream. So any dairy product from his farm is just wonderful. He does a great yogurt as well. It's not a really thick Greek yogurt, so I don't have that here today, but definitely this cream is what I would recommend. And I don't usually measure this part. I think the recipe says about a cup of cream.
Someone said, just while you're doing that, they put a slice of bread into their spice grinder to clean it and grind it because it's moist and it'll pick up the little bits. And then Mark asked, some drizzle cakes call for perforating the top before pouring on the syrup, but you didn't do that.
They do. Hey, Mark.
Yeah, I think it's Mark. I think it's the Mark that we know.
The Mark that we know. Yes, that's a great point. A lot of recipes do suggest to poke your cake with what's it called? Skewer, or like a toothpick or something, a fork, just to make there be holes for that syrup to go down. But my experience is that this cake, once you go down like a couple centimeters, is super moist already. It's just the top part that has dried out. So I find that unnecessary, and also it kind of dirties up your appearance of the cake if you're going to be serving it like this. If you're going to be icing it with a thick icing, then by all means, if you want to do that. But I think you'll find it's so moist in the interior that you don't really need that. Okay, so we are now going to whip the cream. Most old recipes say to be sure that your cream is chilled and everything is very cold for whipping cream.
I'm going to mute again when we go to beat this, so if everybody hears the sound drop out, that's on purpose, so it doesn't deafen anybody.
Yeah, so I'm just seeing how I explained it to you guys. So let's just add everything in right away. Sometimes I'll start whipping it a little bit, but I found it really doesn't matter. So we're going to add a little bit of sugar. And this, feel free to adjust to your taste. I find that the cake is quite sweet itself. Not too sweet, but sufficiently sweet that your cream kind of wants to be like barely sweetened. I only put enough for it to be kind of clear that it's in the dessert camp, that it's not like a savory cream, but not too much at all. It's much less than you would usually do for a typical whipped cream. Anytime I add sugar to a recipe, I like to add salt. That's because it brings out the sweetness of the sugar, but just a pinch. And then I'm going to put a little, just splash of rose water. And I do like the rose water again with the sort of cultured cream, the yogurt flavor is just really nice. So try it. Maybe just try a little bit if you're hesitant about the rose water, but I think it works really nicely. Okay, so we'll blend this for a second.
All right, I'm going to mute again in just a second so we can not deafen you while we keep blending. But for those of you who joined us a little bit late, who didn't get a chance to at the beginning, I'd love to know where people are from. We already have such a great list. So if you didn't quite get that in there in the beginning, I'd love to know where people are watching from. But we're going to mute again in just a second as the meters start up again so we don't deafen everybody.
Oh, I wish we could all be here so I could show you this. This is super exciting. This cream is so yellow. Usually my whipped cream is not this yellow, and I think it's really because of this Butterworks Farm cream. If you can see that, compared to the yogurt that is really white, this is, again, just what happens when you have an amazing cream. If you go too far, you probably know you will whip your cream into butter. We don't want that, although it wouldn't be bad, but then I'm just going to fold in a little bit of yogurt. And again, you can do this to taste. If you like it a little bit more tangy, you can use a little bit more. I'd say don't do more than 50% yogurt, or it will just kind of, the yogurt flavor will overpower the cream. But this is really the trick of what gives it that nice cultured flavor. Okay, so our final step, I think, will be, you could either just cut your cake and then serve it with the dollop of cream by the slice on the plate, or we can just perhaps put a little bit here on top in the center. And I would probably grind up some of the rose petals and sprinkle some of the rose petal dust maybe on the center. And sort of ready to go. So voila, your Persian love cake. Feel free to share the stories, the legend that goes with it with your guests. I want to slice it so that you can see the interior. So we'll see. I cooked this probably for a little over an hour.
Do you want me to read you the list of some of the places people are from while you're slicing?
Oh, I'd love to hear.
We have so many people from all over.
I'd love to hear. Yeah.
We've got Columbus, Ohio, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. We've got France, We've got New York City, we've got Atlanta, Georgia, we've got a couple more people in Canada, British Columbia, we've got a bunch of people in California, especially the LA area, but at least like 5 or 6 people in California. We got Toronto, we got a bunch of people here right in Vermont, the New North End and the hill section of Burlington. We've got Yorkshire, UK and London. Got Elk Grove, California, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Oakland, California. I love it. We have people from all over.
Amazing. I love that. Hearing a shout out to everyone in LA. I was just reading today that the largest Iranian population in the US is in Los Angeles, and that you host the largest Nowruz festival of the year, of anywhere in the US. So I wonder if that was able to happen at all this year with COVID, but I would love to get out there sometime.
Lima, Peru.
Lima, Peru.
Seattle, Washington.
So cool. That's amazing. Oh.
Welcome everybody. We're so like global in here. This is great.
So cool. So I wanted to show you, take a look at the texture of this cake. You can see how it is just super moist here. I would say it could have taken even a little bit more time in the oven. It's going to be fine like this. It's just, again, a little bit more challenging to serve. But that's one of the things I love about this cake. It's got this really just dense, moist mouthfeel that is just delicious. So then I'm just going to add a little bit more of the cream by the side, and then it's sort of ready to go. Carrie and I were talking about this earlier. This cake is not a cheap cake to make. The ingredients are quite expensive. I think it was over $50 to purchase ingredients for this cake, actually to make the 2 cakes. But a little bit goes a really long way. It's super rich and just super dense. So I would say that this size is almost a little bit big for your guests. But yeah, maybe start with a thinner sliver to serve. But yeah, it's a super fun cake to make. I think you can really get creative. Feel free to do whatever you get inspired about for the decorations. I was just going to mention that another way to decorate.
I can't hear you if you walk over away from the mic. So point to you.
Oh, sorry. Do you see my little cake? Maybe.
Oh, the one that was like on the little plate.
Oh, here it is. I found it. All right. So I just did a really quick demo to show you of a kind of a mini personal size cake. Sometimes I will make this in a sheet pan and then just use sort of circular cookie cutters to cut little individual slices like this. So just another way to decorate is to make your own icing with either really any liquid plus powdered sugar. So this I used lemon juice plus powdered sugar and a little bit of rose water, and just you keep adding powdered sugar until it's sort of the consistency you want. This is a little bit thicker than what I would use to actually kind of drizzle it on. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab a pastry bag. We have scissors here. This is a trick you can use for icing cakes that's more kind of traditional sort of Wilton type icing, but you can use a piping bag, or you can just use like a sandwich bag. And what we're going to do is just add a little bit of icing. If you fold it back to cover your hand won't get as sticky. And I'm just gonna put a little bit on because it's a tiny little cake here.
So yeah, now's the time. If people have any last minute questions, I see there's some coming into the chat. We'll ask right at the end. So if you've got those questions, go ahead and type them into the chat. We'll do a question session right at the end. We'll
have a little bit of time at the end for questions, and I hope to maybe share a little bit more about the New Year's tradition.
Yep. I'm fine going over a few minutes if people want to hang out and chat about history of the New Year's.
So I've just given the end a little bit of a clip. And then let's see here. You can do this sort of. So you can leave it like that. You can add a second layer. You can make your icing a little bit thicker by making the hole bigger. And then to stick with the red and green theme, I'll just put a little bit of pistachio around the edge here, and then a little bit of rose in the center. And with this, what I would probably do is serve it on a bed of cream. So let me just do that. Let's see, where did I put my, right here. Okay, so I might just kind of put a dollop on a plate. I wouldn't use a white plate for this. I'd use a colored plate so the cream would stand out. And then just maybe sort of serve it like that with a few rose petals on the side. So again, to get this smaller shape, you can just use a circular cookie cutter and bake it in a flat sheet pan, and then do maybe like 12 of those from that pan and do like a personal size cake. It will have a slight different flavor, again, because it's got this powdered sugar icing rather than the syrup.
And then you can make cake pops with all the leftover bits around the edges.
Oh yeah, yeah. There are lots of leftovers, that sort of crumbs that fall around.
Persian Love Cake pops would be amazing. Put little rose petals on top.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So that's what I was going to say about the cake. Feel free to ask any questions. If we have time at the end, if folks are interested, I can share a little bit more about some of the traditions around Nowruz. I should basically make this clear, if it wasn't for my intro, that this cake is not usually served around this holiday traditionally at all, that it really dates back to only 2008. And there are specific dishes that are traditional this time of year for the Persian New Year, again, celebrating the arrival of spring and new beginnings. Nowruz means a new day, sort of a new start. But this cake I thought sort of was a fun recipe to teach, and just a fun time of the year to be teaching it. So I wish you best of luck in your baking, but definitely let me know if there are other questions.
Yeah, back to making the cream, how much yogurt did you add to the mixture, and was it plain Greek yogurt?
Yes, so it was plain Greek yogurt, full fat, and I think in the recipe I call for about, let's see, half a cup of yogurt to 1 cup of heavy cream. Sometimes I'll go a little bit more cultured cream with the yogurt, but yeah, that's
Great.
what I said. Yeah.
How would you store the cake?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, generally this cake, there is not much left if you have a dinner party. But if you are going to be storing it, I would definitely not put any cream on top. Probably what I would do is just use a cake like cover, or even a large pot if you don't have the right size cake cover. But you could just leave it on the counter probably for like 3 days or so, or in the fridge maybe for 5 to 6 days.
But yeah, there's not going to be a lot left after you serve it to people.
I should mention, it is great the next day with coffee. Most people that I know who make this cake like it even better the next day, because it's just a great way to start the day with a little sweet with your coffee. Nice. So.
Someone asked about the rose petals again. So yeah, we mentioned that you want to make sure you're getting culinary grade or food grade rose petals. And if you're trying to make your own, again, you want to make sure they're a culinary or food grade variety, and that you're not spraying them or anything like that, or just search out dried culinary rose petals. Different than drying roses from the florist. Not a great idea.
Right.
Let's see, where's the next question? Now they're all mixed in. What's the best way to cut it? So I guess just like again, those really small slices. As
small as possible. I would even, if your cake is very gooey, you might even want to dip your knife into hot water, sort of like the sushi cutting technique, and then wipe it off between slicing. I would definitely do that. Because it can be hard to slice if it's not fully solidified by baking.
Just people saying we love your sessions and look forward to them. Thank you.
Yay.
And thank you, Anna.
Oh, great. Well, I wanted to just end, since we've been with one further just little comment. We've been talking about something that is not very traditional. I sort of feel responsible to bring us back to some of the more kind of the true traditions of Nowruz. This is a holiday that is celebrated either for 13 days or in some parts of the world for a full month. And again, it celebrates the start of spring. And one of the unique traditions around it. There are a lot of like street festivals. There's a tradition of making fires in the streets and kids jump over the fires, sort of symbolizing like the going out of the old year. There are lots of songs and feasts, but something that each family typically does is to create a table in their home with 7 symbolic objects. And the table is called the Haftzin, and it has 7 items that all start with a Farsi letter F. And these are considered to be auspicious items for the new year, to bring sort of good luck and happiness in the new year. The first is hyacinth, and the blossoms symbolizing spring. The second is garlic, the idea that garlic will protect us from illness and from evil. There's also vinegar, which symbolizes longevity and patience. There are coins, so you'll see golden coins on the table to symbolize prosperity. There is the seed or the fruit of a Persian olive tree called the oleaster tree. And I had never seen this fruit before. It looks like a sort of purple olive. Sometimes they're called Russian olives as well, and that symbolizes love, to bring love into the new year. There's pudding to bring the sweetness of life into the new year. And then the final thing, which is a big prominent, usually in the center of the table, is a sabze, which is green wheatgrass or sprouts of, it could be wheat, it could be barley, or mung beans are used sometimes. And this grass, you've probably seen wheatgrass growing in like juice bars. And it's just this beautiful, vibrant green to symbolize spring. If you don't have access to any of those 7 items, there are 2 items you can substitute for them. One is sumac berries, which you can usually find in Middle Eastern markets. And they symbolize a new beginning, a new dawn, or apples, which will bring us beauty and health for the new year. So those are just a few of the symbolic objects and sort of foods that are used on the Haftzin table. And then generally on the 13th day of Nowruz, the tradition is that families will drive out into the countryside and have a picnic and welcome spring sort of with a picnic. And then you take your wheatgrass and you throw it into flowing water, maybe a river or a stream. And that symbolizes sort of anything that's not so good about the old year, that you let it go. So those are just a few words about the Persian New Year celebrations.
Awesome.
So,
a couple more questions?
Any final questions?
Yeah, a couple people asking about, again, like the half recipe, will that work? And then the cooking time for the 6-inch springform pan. So even if you just have like an estimation of how long they should do.
Okay, yeah, so definitely the half recipe should work. And the pan, I would say, if it's the same thickness, perhaps it would need as much as 30 minutes or so, 30 to 40 minutes even. But just, give it the toothpick test and see when a toothpick comes out clean. But I'd start with 30 minutes.
Great. And someone else wondering how long you mix the heavy cream for to get to your desired texture.
That's a good question. I can't say because each cream really varies, but you are looking for it to be the texture of, almost like a kind of creamy yogurt or egg whites when they've been beaten. I wish we could be here together. This is the type of thing that's so hard to explain without actually seeing it in person. But their cream goes through like 2 or 3 different phases. When it's super creamy, then it starts to thicken up a little bit more, and then it gets like pretty thick. And then if you let it go even more, it will basically turn into butter, and it sort of like almost looks like it curdles into chunks. And so you want to get it where it's like really thick and will stand up stiff by itself right before it goes into the sort of butter formations. So I used to have to make butter as a kid. My school was based on a farm, and it was like this really exciting process of right before it turned to butter, it was like whipped cream, and we would all try to like stick our finger in and eat it. So I'm very kind of attuned to when that is about to happen. But yeah, you want it to be able to stand up thick before, right before it would go to the butter stage. Because then when you blend in the yogurt, you're going to want to be folding it together. And if it's not thick enough, you can't really fold those 2 in together.
Great. Doesn't look like there's any other questions in the chat. I'll leave it open for like 1 more minute in case people are frantically typing. But thank you all so much for joining us. Like I mentioned, I'll send out an email tomorrow with a survey link. I'll send out Anna's email as well because Anna wants to know if anybody wants to be added to her class list. So I'll send that out as well, or you can email back to me. Yeah, and I would just love to know your thoughts. If you made this cake, I'd love to see pictures of it. I'd love for you to send me some pictures, and I'll share those with Anna as well. So
yeah, I'd love to hear how this process goes for you. And I remain available if you have any further questions. You know, after you've actually baked the cake, feel free to shoot me an email. I do maintain an email list about upcoming classes I'm teaching online. So if you want to be on that, just let me know. But thank you so much for tuning in, especially on this beautiful spring evening. We had a lot of competition with the outdoor just weather tonight. But I really appreciated all the questions. Yeah, this is super fun. And I wish you all the best with baking the Persian Love Cake.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your night. Bye-bye.
Bye.